Okay, our next podcast is going to go into another group of microorganisms, a eukaryotic group of microorganisms. We've talked about bacteria and archaea. Now we move to a more complex group of microorganisms, the protists. Protists are a very diverse group, and there's been a lot of changes that have occurred in the systematics or the grouping of this category, but they're very diverse and microorganisms. But also there is a group of multicellular protists that we'll talk about. Some of the multicellular algae fall into this category, but it's a diverse group and includes a lot of different things. And again, they're all eukaryotic, so we're moving to more diverse types of microorganisms. Usually they can be divided into two categories, and that would be the photosynthetic and then the heterotrophic. So we can kind of call those the plant-like because they're photosynthetic, and then the animal-like. And these are the sometimes also referred to as the algae. The plant-like would be our unicellular algae, and then the plant-like, yeah, and then the animal-like or the heterotrophic would be the protozoans, is a name that's used for that group of animal-like protists. Okay. As I mentioned, we there's been a lot of changes that have occurred to the grouping of this category, um, and but we're going to look at the major groups and classifications in this of the protist. Now, in the for their reproduction, they can reproduce both sexually and asexually. So there are some of these protists that reproduce, release sperm and egg to fertilize, and then some that can actually just divide from one cell into two cells, producing an offspring. So there's varied modes of reproduction with this group. Okay, so we're going to start by looking at the animal type protists, those that are heterotrophic. We'll look at those first, and then come back and look at the plant-like. So the animal-like would be those that have to ingest food, that have to take in food for nutrients, and the a term that's used for these are the protozoans, and they're found pretty much everywhere on the earth. There's some that are found in the soil, terrestrial types. There are freshwater, saltwater types, many different types of protozoans. And we're going to look at the different categories of protozoans. Okay, the first one we mentioned here are the flagellates, and the flagellates are any of these types of protists that have flagella. Here's an example of one right here, and you can see flagella we mentioned in earlier podcast are the extensions that come off the cell, long extensions that the organism uses to move around. So it's kind of like a little motor that spins around and moves, and they can have one or two or multiple flagella. This animal right here, this protist right here rather, is has multiple flagella that come out, and these are flagellates. This one specifically is one that is called Gardia. Gardia is a parasitic type of flagellate that is transmitted through water, and it is a very common cause of a gastrointestinal disorder. So it's one of the main reasons that you need to filter water before drinking it, because this can contaminate water sources and can cause harm to people that drink it. So Giardia is an example of that flagellate. We can refer to them as the zooflagellate, and because it's animal type. But that's an example of a protozoan, an animal type Protist. The next one that we mentioned there is a apicomplexan. Apicomplexans are parasitic, and they are parasites on animals. They can affect humans, and they can cause some serious human diseases. One of these is is malaria, but there's other diseases transmitted by these protists. But apicomplexans are going to have a host, and then they have a vector. A vector is something that transmits the organism. We talked about that with some bacteria as well, are transmitted via vectors. But these apicomplexans are very often transmitted by mosquitoes, and they can, through a mosquito bite, be transmitted to a host. And they can produce these infectious spores inside of people. So here's a life cycle here of apicomplexan. This apicomplexan is called the plasmodium. And so here's the mosquito bite. It gets into the bloodstream of humans, and it travels, these plasmodiums travel to the liver, where they can reproduce and produce spores in the liver. Once the liver cell bursts, these spores travel into the bloodstream, where they can release these gametocytes, which can grow then into both male and female gametes. And then they can fertilize into a zygote that releases more of these sporocytes into the body. And so this can cause the disease, malaria, and other diseases are caused in this fashion. But that's an apicomplexan, all right? And so that is a heterotrophic protist. And the next group that we look at are the sarcodines. The sarcodines include the amoebas, and the here's an amoeba here. The amoebas are these are microscopic animal type protists that have movable or flexible membranes around them. So this is a single cell, and its membrane surrounds, it can engulf its food or its prey, what it's going to eat, that it has to intake, because it is heterotrophic. And so it extends, this membrane of the cell extends around its food materials. And these extensions that come off of the cell are called pseudopods. And the word pseudopod actually means false foot. Pseudo refers to false, and pod is foot. So this is a false foot. But it extends around its food, it engulfs that, and then it takes it in and absorbs the nutrients in there, and that's how it survives. It can also use these false feet for moving about, so it extends these for motility as well. But that is a group called the sarcodines, and the amoebas are in that group. And the last group here of the animal type protists that we mentioned are the ciliates. The ciliates are these animal type protists that have numerous cilia that are found on the cell wall. Let's see. Here's an example of the ciliates here. So cilia are different from flagellate. A flagella is a long extension that comes off of the cell, and you can have usually cells will just have one or two or just a few, but cilia, these organisms will just pretty much cover the cell. They're very numerous cilia, and they're short hair-like projections that come off of the cell. So they're both projections that come off the cell that the cell uses for moving about or catching food. But the flagella is a large structure, and it's usually just found in small numbers, one or two. And the cilia are small projections, and they usually are found in numerous numbers on the cell. So here's an example of paramecium, and you can see these small hair-like projections that just surround the entire cell, and it again uses it for moving around. And but all of these in this group, the ciliates, are going to have this. This shows the reproductive life cycle of one of these ciliates, the paramecium, which is a very common ciliate. And so they go through meiosis, producing their haploid cells that are going to have a unique set of information which can be transferred via conjunction. So they can actually trade these little micronuclei, and then they'll have the genetics, haploid genetics from two different cells, and then those nuclei can fuse and then develop into a macronucleus, and that gives us a unique set. So it is combining genetics in a sexual fashion, but they can also reproduce asexually. Okay, so that's it for the animal type protists, and now we can look at the plant-like protists. And actually, we'll do this in the next podcast. And so the next podcast will cover the plant-like protists, and also we have the algae, which are multicellular protists that we will look at as well. So we'll do that in the next podcast.